What is going on, everybody? I'm going to try to do this as fast as possible without rushing. This is the Dirty Dozen for the King's Gambit. Look at the list. I've already done 12 traps, the Dirty Dozens for the Scotch, the Carol-Con, the Scandinavian, the Petrov, the Roy Lopez, the Sicilian, and the Italian. I'll go ahead and add a link to those in the description. I would highly recommend checking those out. Maybe just one of them if you happen to play that specific opening. Let's go. First one is going to be an easy one to break the ice, and it's out of the King's Gambit declined lines. E4, E5, F4. Bishop's going to come to C5, and we want to bring our knight to F3 to prevent the queen from throwing a check in. Black's going to close up the pawn structure with D6, and we want to finish development of our kingside pieces. Bishop to C4. Black's going to come in and pin our knight to our queen, and that's when we want to go ahead and take out the E5 pawn. If they don't recapture, we can go ahead and capture the D pawn after they develop a piece. But if they do recapture, that's a big boo-boo, because we have the awesome move, Bishop F7 check. Now, if the king does not capture the bishop and happens to go like here, or F8, we just go ahead and move our bishop back to safety. If they happen to bring the king to D7, that's when we can bring in the knight to E5 with check, and then pick up the bishop afterwards. So let's assume for a second they go ahead and take the bishop. Now we can jump our knight to E5 and check the king a second time. Once the king moves, regardless of where it goes, we're going to capture the bishop with the queen. There's one exception. If the king goes to F8, first we want to bring our rook to F1 with a check. Once they block it, then we go ahead and pick up the bishop with our queen. As I said, if they go to any square, we pick up the bishop with our queen, even if the king comes towards our knight for the attack. Doesn't matter what square they use, E6, F6, dope, right? We capture the bishop with our queen. When they capture our knight with the king, we have queen to F5 check, and they only have 2 ways to go. Standard thinking, you would think that the king would go towards their army, so if the king goes to D6, you bring your queen over to D5. Now the king only has 1 square to go to, and once it goes there, you pick up the bishop as well with check. Once they block it or the king moves, you can do anything you want. You can castle kingside now that that pesky dark squared bishop is gone, the whole 9. Last thing we have to talk about is if the king makes the dumb move and goes to D4. It is checkmate in 6, and there's 2 ways you could start it off. You can either push D3, or you can bring your king to E2. Those are the lines. You want to take a look at it. I'm not going to run through it. It'd take too much time, and it's very almost irrelevant since the king is almost never going to go to D4 instead of D6. That wraps up trap number 1, and on to trap number 2. Bringing it back to 1880, there was a famous game between Wade and Alfonse Goetz, Goetz. I don't know how to pronounce it. But this is for black, and what makes it King's Gambit accepted instead of declined is E takes F. White made the mistake of not preventing queen to H4, and they played B3, looking to fianchetto their dark squared bishop. Queen went ahead and came out to H4 with check, and white only has 2 options, move the king or block it. They chose to block it, and that's when the F pawn captured the G pawn. And the second mistake here was white playing H3. From this position, it is a beautiful finish with checkmate in 3. The G3 pawns push to G2, and that's a discovery check, and there's no piece to block, so the king must go to the only square, E2. That's when the queen swoops over and captures the E4 pawn. There's no piece to block, so the king must walk to F2. Do you guys see it? Pawn capture rook under promotion to a knight. Checkmate. Ain't that a beautiful something? We're going to go ahead and piggyback off of this trap leading into the next one. And that is making the same mistake and allowing black to play 3 H4 check. But instead of making the move like B3, a move like D4 is almost just as bad. These are just 2 examples of moves which allow it. And after the queen comes in for check, white has the same options, run or block. If it blocks, you want to go ahead and capture the G3 pawn, and a lot of moves make sense. One that seems to be good is bringing the knight to F3, attacking the queen. But unfortunately, you can just push the pawn to G2 with a discovery check. And after the knight picks up the queen, the pawn can take the rook and promote to queen. I've had this happen myself, and I'll show you right here. While this is playing, I'll go ahead and set up the board for the next trap, trap number 4. And you're seeing this in real time. This is not sped up. It happened that fast, and I was able to get a W out of this game. Have another beautiful trap for white. E4, E5, F4, E takes F, King's Gambit accepted. And we have the Bishop Gambit, C4, Fisher's fave. And now we have Queen to H4 check, and the King just sidesteps to F1. Now the dark square Bishop hits C5, threatening Queen F2 checkmate. So we're going to go push D4, kicking that Bishop back to B6. Now we can bring out our Knight and kick the Queen away too. The third most popular move is D8. So off the Queen goes to D8. We can go ahead and grab the pawn on F4 now with our dark squared Bishop, and black is looking to castle kingside, so they bring the Knight to E7. That's when we make a threat of our own with jumping our Knight to G5, doubling up on the F7 square. Now, there's only two things that they can do logically to stop that. One is pushing D5. The other one would be just giving away the Knight. That's kind of dumb. Or they can castle. If they castle, then the rook would cover the F7 square. But that would be a huge mistake and be game over. From here, it is checkmate in 22 if you let the computer run long enough. You bring the Queen to H5, and that is the nail in the coffin. Black has to push H6 to avoid immediate checkmate. We can go ahead and take the F7 pawn. They have to take it with the rook, and we can recapture with the queen, forcing the king to the corner. I'm going to put the full checkmate line up in the screen just to save about 20 minutes. Moving on to the next. Trap number 5. This probably should have been the first. It's the most simplest. After E4, E5, and F4, if we bring the bishop out to C5 and white makes the mistake of capturing our E5 pawn, it is game over. Queen H4 check. White has two options. If they block it with the G pawn, we come over, scoop up E4 with check. It doesn't matter what they block it with, the queen, the bishop, or the knight. We go ahead and pick up the rook in the corner, and we're going to own the rest of the game. If by chance they're dumb enough to just run with the king, the other option to E2, queen capture E4 is checkmate. Done. Probably should have been the first, right? On to the next. Trap number 6. E4, E5, F4, E takes F. King's Gambit accepted. We're going to go ahead and bring our knight out to F3. And a very popular move back in the 70s and 80s was pushing D5. We're going to go ahead and bring our other knight out to C3. And if D captures E, we want to recapture it with our queen knight. If the bishop then comes out to G4, pinning the knight on F3, we can go ahead and just slide that queen out to E2. And if black makes the fatal mistake of capturing the knight, then we have knight to F6, checkmate. It's a double mate. And anyone knows from a double mate, you can't block or capture. You must move the king. And both squares are occupied by white pieces. E7 with the queen and D7 by the knight. On to the next. Very similar to the first trap. We have E4, E5, F4. Black declines the gambit and brings the bishop to C5. That's when white will bring the knight to F3 to prevent queen H4 check. Black closes up the pawn structure with D6, and we're going to play C3, looking to push D4 and tear up the middle. Black sees that after D4, E takes D, C takes D, the queen can capture E4 with check. And that's exactly what happens. D4 is pushed, E takes D, C takes D, and the queen comes through and grabs E4 with check. Instead of blocking the check with the queen or light squared bishop, white plays this weird move, king to F2. And that's when black will back up the bishop to B6. Bishop B5 check. And regardless of what black does, block with a knight, block with a pawn, whatever have you, white's got the incredible move, rook to e1, hitting the queen against the king. Queen's going to fall, and you'll have an excellent game. And just to be very thorough, if black doesn't block the check and decides to move the king off of the e column, doesn't matter if it goes to d8 or f8, the rook's still going to come over and hit the queen, and when the queen gets out of the way, rook to e8 is going to be checkmate. On to the next. In my Scotch Mega Tutorial, Volume 12, is the Gullum Cassim variation. At the 9-minute mark, I introduce a trap that's in a novelty line that I found after hours and hours of playing with lines. Same thing can be applied here. It's actually in the Falkbeer counter gambit, it's called. E4, E5, F4, D5. E takes D. C6 is pushed. Queen comes to E2. We let them take the E5 pawn, so we grab the D5 pawn. Queen scoops up E5, and we have a lot of pieces we could block with, but we can trick them. By blocking with the dark squared bishop, the queen may try to grab the G7 pawn. That's game over for them, because bishop to F6 kicks the queen back, and it only has one safe square, G3. And that allows us to put our bishop on H4, pinning that queen to the king. Bobby Fischer used to be a huge fan of the bishop's gambit, and that is E4, E5, F4, king's gambit accepted, E takes F, and then instead of preventing the queen from coming to H4, kind of invites it with the move bishop to C4. After the queen comes to H4, the king just sidesteps to F1. In this trap line, the bishop comes to C5, and we fix that by pushing D4. The bishop wants to stay on that diagonal, so they back up to B6, and that's when we bring our knight to F3, kicking the queen out now. If black makes the mistake by putting the queen on G4, you have the slick, slippery move, bishop F7, check. When the king captures the bishop, knight to E5 forks the king and queen. Let's say black is really smart and sees this all coming and decides not to capture the bishop but move the king to one of the other 3 available squares. You can just push H3, and now the queen has no squares to go to except for G3. That allows you to bring your knight to C3, and no matter what white does, even if it captures the bishop, your next move is to jump to E2, and that queen is pegged. It's done. The only move that would have saved it is the king obviously capturing the bishop. That does open up the G6 square now, but now your knight on F3 can go to E5 and fork the king and the queen this way to Sunday. Trap number 10 is a beautiful sequence for black. It comes out of the king's gambit accepted. So E4, E5, F4, E takes F. Knight comes to F3, and that's when we bring our knight to F6. E5 is pushed, kicking away our knight, and we bring it to the rim. And this knight is not so dim, and you'll see why. White brings out his other knight to C3, and that's when we push D6, trying to get rid of that E5 pawn. White totally ignores that, though, and brings the bishop to C4, adding pressure to the F7 pawn. And that's when we go ahead and capture the pawn on E5. White brings the knight up to E5, doubling up the attack on the F7 pawn. But if you notice, that knight always prevents the queen from coming to H4, and that frees it up so we can squeeze in a check with queen to H4. Blocking the check would be disastrous because knight captured G3 with the threat of moving the knight in a discovered attack. White's best try to stop it would be knight to F3, but then we have queen E7. There's nothing they can do, no matter if they block it or move the king. Knight is going to take out the rook in the corner on H1. So more or less, they can't block the pawn. The king's going to have to boogie-woogie to F1. The moment of truth. It all boils down to this. Bishop to E6. Crossing fingers that white does take that bishop on E6. And if it does, You're golden. The knight jumps to g3, checking the king. Now the king's got 3 squares. f2 and e1 are no bueno, because then you have a discovered check when the knight boogies. So the king's got to push himself further to the corner on g1. That's when you bring your bishop to c5 with check. Now, it has nothing to block it with except for the d4 pawn. You go ahead and capture that, and the queen can either capture or the bishop can block. If the bishop blocks, checkmate. And if the queen takes, then you have knight to e2 check. Now the king has to basically run and give up the queen, because if it didn't and tries to capture it with the knight, you have queen e1 checkmate. So after the king boogie woogies, you go ahead and take the queen, and then white will come in and check the king on bishop f7. You can sidestep, and you're going to have a phenomenal end of this one because you're more than 7 up on the computer. On to the next. This is another beautiful trap for white. e4, e5, f4, and it's the King's Gambit accepted line. So e takes f. We're going to jump our knight to f3, and very commonly, black will push g5 to back up the f4 pawn. That's when we develop our bishop out to c4, looking to castle. And that's when black pushes h6, making a nice little pawn chain on the king side. We push h4, looking to break it up, because if they don't capture, let's say they just do something like this, we can capture, and they are unable to capture with the h-pawn, and it's going to divide up their pawns into several islands, which is very good for us. They would be more or less forced to do something else. So what do? They go ahead and push f6, looking to be able to recapture with the f-pawn. That's when we make the awesome, miraculous move, knight to e5, looking to fork the queen and rook. Now, if black were to make the mistake and capture the knight to stop that, because we were already winning, we have the awesome sequence, queen h5 check. Has nothing to block. The queen must go to e7. Then we have queen f7 check. The king's got to go to d6, the only available square. Then we got queen d5 check. King's got to go right back to e7. And then nail in the coffin, queen e5, le checkmate. On to the next. We're going to do the dirty dozenth one, the 12th trap for black, and it's a good one. Telling you, you got to try that Falkbeer counter gambit. That's the e4, e5, f4, and you push d5. Got to try it. So if white develops the knight like naturally to f3, we want to scoop up the e-pawn and kick the knight. Knight's going to come through and take our e5 pawn, and that's when we can just develop our queenside knight to c6. If they try pinning our knight to our king, we can technically ignore that because we got a little idea over here. With 2 moves in the right sequence, first being knight to f6, we can go ahead and let them take it. So they capture our knight, we recapture, and they capture with their bishop checking our king. We have the best move ever. Bishop d7. You're like, what? Let them take the rook in the corner with the bishop, because we have bishop g4. Yeah. We set it up with the knight move, and that queen has nowhere to go. It is trapped. It's got nothing to block, and its best move is basically coming through and taking our queen. And when we recapture, we are golden. We're about 4 points up on the PC. And that'll wrap things up for now. And a reminder, check out my other Dirty Dozen trap videos. They're absolutely great. You don't have to look at them all, but let's say you play the Scandinavian as black and the Italian as white. Go check out those videos. I promise you, you will not regret it. And I would appreciate it for once if you threw something in the comment section. I usually get 50 to 100 views a video and like 1 comment. Let me know what you did or didn't like about this video, and if you have any requests or ideas for a future Dirty Dozen video, Let me know. Throw it down below.